I was sent to negotiate peace because I was expendable. That was the unspoken truth, hovering over the command chamber as the order was delivered. Earth and the Karvak's dominion had been at war for 12 brutal cycles. Entire colonies burned in orbit and oceans boiled under orbital strikes. Neither side could afford another escalation. So diplomats failed and soldiers died, and finally, someone decided to send a voice instead of a fleet. I was not a general or a politician. I was a linguist turned signal officer. I knew alien dialects and psychological resonance patterns. That made me useful and disposable at the same time. The Karvaks were ruled by a single sovereign known simply as the Queen. She had never been seen by humans. Every attempt at communication ended in silence or annihilation. Her court spoke through drones and execution fleets. No one knew what she looked like or how she thought. The plan was simple, in the way only desperate plans ever are. I would enter the neutral chamber on the shattered moon of Illa. I would speak the prepared peace accord aloud in Galactic common and in Karvak's resonance speech. Then I would wait. If she accepted, the war would end. If she rejected, the chamber would be erased from existence along with me. As my shuttle detached from the carrier, I recorded a final message to Earth Command. Not a goodbye, but an observation. War ends when someone decides to stop being afraid of dying. At the time, I did not know how deeply personal that truth would become. The moon of Illa rotated slowly beneath me, cracked and hollowed from ancient mining. The neutral chamber was an open sphere of black alloy suspended over the surface. No guards, no weapons, no escape. Just a place to speak and be heard. I stepped inside and felt the gravity shift. The chamber sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath. Lights dimmed. Air vibrated. And then I began to speak. I spoke the words exactly as scripted. Each phrase carried mathematical balance and cultural appeasement. Promises of borders, resource sharing, mutual survival. It was the most careful speech ever written by human minds. As my voice echoed through the chamber, the temperature dropped. Not physically, but emotionally. Something was listening. The air folded inward. Reality bent as a presence emerged. Not a body at first, but a pressure that made my bones ache. Then she appeared. The alien queen was vast and luminous. Her form shifted between solidity and light. Crown-like structures rose from her head, grown not forged. Her eyes were stars held in place by will alone. I did not stop speaking. Training carried me forward, even as fear tried to paralyze me. Then it happened. Mid-sentence, the queen froze. Her radiance dimmed. The chamber fell into absolute stillness. I finished the line and lowered my hands. Silence stretched. When she spoke, it was not through sound alone. It vibrated through my skull and memories alike. She said my designation in perfect human phonetics. Then she said something impossible. She said my childhood call sign. A name spoken only once in my life. A name I had buried with the person who gave it to me. The queen trembled, her vast form contracting as if struck. I realized then that she was not reacting to my words. She was reacting to my voice. She did not kill me. She did not order the fleets to fire. Instead, she asked me to speak again. I spoke my name, my origin, my purpose. Each word caused ripples of visible distortion across her form. She told me a story older than human spaceflight, of a distant battlefield where a dying Karvak scout ship drifted into unknown space, of a human rescue crew that should have ignored it but did not. She described a single human voice speaking softly through a cracked helmet channel. reading stories, singing fragments of songs, keeping an injured alien consciousness stable long enough for rescue. That voice, she said, carried compassion encoded in its tone, a resonance that altered neural patterning, a sound that rewrote instinct. That injured scout had been her. The queen of the Karvax had once been a nameless explorer, saved by a human who never knew the impact of his kindness. I understood then why my voice mattered. The man who saved her had been my father. I carried the same vocal resonance, the same cadence shaped by shared language and memory. When I spoke, she heard him, and the war stopped making sense. The queen withdrew her presence slightly, as if allowing herself vulnerability. She admitted the war began from fear, from misinterpreted signals and inherited aggression, from forgetting that the universe once held strangers who helped instead of destroyed. She asked me to speak freely, not as an envoy, but as a human. I told her of Earth cities rebuilt from ash, of children who learned alien constellations before human history, of soldiers who wondered why they were fighting beings they had never met. As I spoke, the chamber changed. Hard metal softened into living crystal, the environment responding to emotional harmonics. She confessed that Karvax culture revered strength but feared weakness, that compassion was treated as a flaw. Yet one act of mercy had shaped her entire existence. Peace, she said, could not be signed on paper. It had to be remembered in voices. She accepted the accord not as a ruler, but as a survivor. The queen transmitted the ceasefire herself. Every Karvax fleet stood down within moments. Weapons powered down. Siege formations dissolved. I returned to Earth not as a hero, but as proof that kindness could echo across species and centuries. The treaty was ratified. Borders stabilized. Trade began. Yet the true peace was quieter. Years later, I sometimes received transmissions from Karvax space, requests for cultural exchange, for recordings of human voices reading stories. The queen never appears in public anymore. She rules through consensus now, through memory rather than fear. As for me, I teach voice resonance and xenolinguistics. I tell my students that words matter, but how you say them can change the fate of galaxies. I was sent to negotiate peace, but what ended the war was a voice that remembered how to save a life. Peace did not arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a long exhale after centuries of holding breath. In the months following the treaty, the galaxy felt unfamiliar. Trade lanes once choked with warships now carried diplomats and engineers. Old battle zones became meeting grounds where enemies compared scars instead of weapons. Yet beneath the surface calm, something deeper was unfolding. The Queen requested continued contact with me, not as an envoy, but as a voice. She said leadership required reminders of who one had been before power hardened the self. Our conversations were not recorded. They were not translated for councils or archives. They were simply spoken. She asked me to read to her human literature, myths, even mundane reports, anything spoken without fear or performance. She explained that Karvax cognition was deeply tied to tonal memory. Voices shaped identity more than images or symbols. A ruler who forgot the sound of vulnerability inevitably became a tyrant. I read stories my father once read to me. Tales of lost travelers finding shelter among strangers. Of fragile beings surviving because someone chose mercy over efficiency. Each time I spoke, I felt the same resonance ripple outward. Not just toward her, but beyond. into the vast network of Carvax consciousness linked through biopsychic channels. Entire generations were hearing that resonance for the first time. The Queen told me that young Carvax no longer dreamed of conquest. They dreamed of voices, of languages layered with emotion rather than command. Some elders resisted. They argued peace had weakened the Dominion, that humanity had softened their queen. She did not silence them. She invited them to listen. One by one, dissenters were brought into shared auditory chambers, where recordings of my father's rescue transmission were preserved, where my voice continued the pattern. Many emerged changed. Some resigned their positions. Others wept openly, a behavior once thought impossible for their species. The Queen explained that empathy, once awakened, could not be undone without self-destruction. Meanwhile, humanity struggled with its own transformation. Peace had removed a unifying enemy, and old divisions resurfaced quickly. I was asked to speak before human assemblies, to explain why the war ended, to justify trusting an empire that once burned worlds. I did not speak of treaties or strategic advantage. I spoke of a frightened alien bleeding in the void, of a human who chose to speak kindness into the dark instead of pulling away. Some listened, some did not, but voices travel farther than arguments. Years passed. The Queen aged differently than humans, her form growing less radiant, more defined. She told me this was intentional, that she was becoming less myth and more person, a ruler who could be replaced without collapse. Succession planning among the Carvax now involved memory sharing rather than dominance trials. Future leaders were required to listen to the voices of those they once considered beneath them. The Queen said this idea frightened her more than any human weapon ever had, because it meant the Dominion would survive without her. One day, she asked me to stop calling her Queen. She chose a personal name translated loosely as the one who was heard. I honored that request, and something in her presence finally relaxed. Near the end of her reign, she made one final request of me. She asked me to speak to the entire Dominion at once, not as a diplomat, not as a symbol, but as a son. I spoke of my father, of how he never knew the life he saved would one day save billions, of how kindness often feels small because its true scale unfolds beyond our sight. Across Carvax space, entire fleets powered down to listen. Cities fell silent. Children gathered around resonance pillars the way humans once gathered around fires. When I finished, there was no applause, only stillness, the kind that signals something irreversible has occurred. The Queen stepped down shortly after, not in disgrace or weakness, but in fulfillment. Her successor did not declare a new era. They simply continued speaking. As for me, I eventually stopped traveling between stars. My voice grew older, rougher. Yet the resonance remained. Students now carry it forward. Humans and Carvax are like learning to shape sound with intention, understanding that war often begins when voices stop listening. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the first transmission my father ever sent. Static-filled, fragmented, imperfect, yet alive with care. That recording is now preserved in both human and Carvax archives, labeled not as a military artifact, but as the moment the galaxy remembered how to speak. I was sent to negotiate peace, but peace was never negotiated. It was remembered, spoken aloud, and allowed to echo long enough to change everything. After the Queen stepped away from power, the galaxy entered a phase no strategist had prepared for. It was not chaos nor celebration. It was silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of urgency, a stillness that followed centuries of reacting instead of choosing. The Karvak's dominion did not fracture as many feared, nor did it tighten into authoritarian control. Instead, it slowed. Decisions once made in moments of instinct were now debated in cycles of listening. Command structures reshaped themselves around councils of memory bearers. Individuals trained not in dominance, but in resonance awareness. Humans struggled to understand this transformation. Our cultures were built around momentum, around progress measured by speed rather than depth. I was invited to observe the first joint human Karvak's conclave held on neutral ground. Not as a speaker this time, but as a witness. The chamber was vast and open. No thrones, no elevated platforms. Only concentric circles where beings of different forms positioned themselves by choice rather than rank. The Karvak's delegates did not arrive with guards. They arrived with listeners, individuals whose sole purpose was to remember what was said and how it was said. Human diplomats fidgeted, unused to speaking without interruption or agenda, unused to pauses that lasted minutes instead of seconds. When discussion began, it did not start with borders or resources. It began with shared silence. At first, the silence was uncomfortable. Human hearts raced. Thoughts scrambled for something to fill the void. But the Karvaks remained still, teaching without instruction, demonstrating that silence was not emptiness, but preparation. When voices finally rose, they did so carefully, each speaker aware that their tone would shape not only policy, but perception. Every word carried responsibility beyond intent. I realized then that peace was not a state. It was a discipline. Outside the conclave, the galaxy continued adjusting. Former soldiers sought purpose beyond command hierarchies. Shipyards retooled for exploration instead of armament. Some resisted the change. Black market fleets and extremist factions attempted to reignite old hatreds. But they found recruitment difficult. The young had grown up hearing voices instead of alarms. They recognized fear-based rhetoric immediately and turned away. The Karvaks, once feared as unstoppable conquerors, became quiet travelers. Their ships redesigned for sensory exchange rather than intimidation. Their presence no longer announced by weapon signatures, but by harmonic identifiers. Humans began adopting similar systems. Communication channels tuned to emotional transparency. Distress signals redesigned to carry comfort as well as urgency. I withdrew further from public life, not out of bitterness or fatigue, but because my role had changed. A voice cannot remain central forever. If it does, it becomes authority instead of reminder. I settled on a small orbital habitat near the edge of explored space, teaching students who came not to learn diplomacy, but to understand listening. Among them were humans, Karvaks, and others once caught between empires, species who had survived by adapting to louder powers, now learning they could be heard without shouting. One student asked me once why my voice carried resonance, why it affected others so deeply. I told them the truth as simply as I could. That resonance is not strength. It is consistency. A voice becomes powerful when it aligns with action across time, when it says the same thing in fear as it does in safety. Years passed quietly, the kind of quiet that builds rather than erodes. Then one day, a transmission arrived from Karvak space, encoded not as an emergency, but as a memory request. A new leader had taken responsibility for a distant frontier, an area once scarred by early human Karvak skirmishes. They wished to begin governance by remembering. They asked for my presence, not physically, but vocally. I recorded a message, not prepared or polished, simply honest. I spoke of mistakes, of fear, of how easy it is to dehumanize the unknown. I spoke of my father again, of how he never saw peace as his responsibility, only the life in front of him. That recording was played at the Frontier World's dedication ceremony. No banners raised, no anthems played, just voices. Later I learned that the settlement chose not to name itself after any leader or battle. They named it after a concept, a translation that roughly meant the place where one listens first. As my own voice aged further, I worried about its eventual absence, about what would remain when it could no longer carry resonance. The Karvaks had an answer for this. They taught me how to embed vocal memory into harmonic seeds, organic constructs that preserved not just sound but intention. I recorded my final teachings into one such seed, not as doctrine, but as reminder. It would activate only in moments of extreme conflict, releasing not commands, but stories. Stories of voices choosing kindness in the dark. I do not know when it will be used, or if it ever will be. But that uncertainty no longer frightens me, because peace, I have learned, does not require permanence, only renewal. I was sent to negotiate peace, but what endured was not the agreement. It was the habit of listening, passed from voice to voice, across species, across generations, long after the war learned how to be quiet.